Chapter 10. Very soon my father heard about what had happened. He called Fallingford on a line that hissed and rustled, and I had to listen to a lot of very upset shouting down the phone. I tried to explain that I was quite all right now because the murderer had been taken away. "But another murder, Hazel!" cried my father, sounding as though he was very far away and upside down. "How do you find these things? It's that friend of yours, Daisy. I don't like her." "It's not her fault that someone was murdered in her house," I said. "I can't hear you. I said I don't like her and I don't like all these murders. I want you safe. Do I need to come over and be with you for the next holidays?" "No," I shouted. "I think I ought to. Yes, I will. I'll take you travelling. I don't like that friend of yours. Did you hear me?" "No," I shouted again, and then the operator cut us off. The day before we had to go back to Deepdene for the summer term, we had another telephone conversation, this time with the inspector. Hetty called us to the phone as quietly as she could. Daisy's father was still not at all fond of the police, and we knew that he wouldn't like Inspector Priestley contacting us. "Mr. Bampton's confessed," said the inspector. It was what I had been waiting for, but all the same it gave me a horrible jolt. I almost dropped the receiver and Daisy had to catch it for me. "He's in prison, awaiting a trial. Because he's 17, he'll be tried as a minor. He won't face the death penalty." I felt quite dizzy for a moment. I discovered that although I still couldn't forgive Stephen for what he had done, I didn't want him to be hanged for it. I suppose that makes me terribly weak, but there it is. I was glad. "Oh," said Daisy, as though she had just been told that the weather would be cloudy tomorrow. "I see. And I suppose you've taken all the credit again." "What do you take me for, Madam Super?" asked Inspector Priestley, and even in his tinny phone voice I could hear his laughter. "There's a line in my official report that reads, 'Acting on a tip-off from schoolgirl detectives Daisy Wells and Hazel Wong, I arrested Stephen Bampton and solved the case.'" "Really?" cried Daisy. "Not really," I said, coming back to myself with an effort. "It's a joke." "No, not really," the inspector echoed. "But you are both mentioned, although not by name. I've credited you as far as I can. I'm extremely grateful. You've saved me from making an enormous and costly mistake, arresting Lord Hastings for a crime he didn't commit. I'd have never heard the end of it." "I think this time we ought to get medals," said Daisy, grinning at me over the receiver. "They're in the post," said the inspector. "Now, I must go. Keep up the good work. You really do have a most successful detective society." I thought he was joking about the medals, but it turned out I was wrong. That very afternoon the post brought a fat parcel addressed to Miss Wells and Miss Wong. Daisy scrabbled it open and shook it, and onto her bedspread rolled 4 shiny silver badges. They said "Detective" on them, and Daisy squealed with excitement. She pinned hers to her blouse and it winked up at me ferociously. "Now we're really proper detectives," she said with a sigh of happiness. There was a movement in the doorway and I saw Bertie standing there. He was looking at Daisy and her badge, and his face was quite blank. Then he turned away and shut the door. I couldn't quite bring myself to wear mine after that. I stuffed it down at the bottom of my tuck box and left it there. On Saturday morning we were down early, ready to be driven back to school. Our things had been packed by Hetty, and now Mrs. Docherty was fussing over us in the hall, trying to fit just one more cake into my tuck box and one more murder mystery into Daisy's. "But perhaps you ought to stick to reading them for the moment," she told Daisy. "I think you've experienced quite enough to last you a lifetime." Said Daisy, narrowing her eyes and staring off into the distance thoughtfully. Then the door from the garden banged open, and Lord Hastings was standing there in his Barber jacket, Millie and Toast Dog surging around his boots. There had been a sort of ceasefire since the end of the case. Lord and Lady Hastings were talking again, carefully and with many pauses, but talking all the same. None of us wanted to even breathe in case we jinxed it. "Daughter," he said, "daughter's friend." For a moment it was as if we were back at the beginning of the holiday again, and none of the dreadful things had happened. "Hello, Daddy," said Daisy. "We're off to school." "So you are," said her father, walking towards us. Then he paused and rubbed his chest thoughtfully. "Probably a good thing," he added at last. "This house, not exactly the right place for you at the moment." "You'll be all right," said Daisy, and I couldn't tell whether she meant it as a question or not. "I always am," said Lord Hastings. "Things have a way of working out." He paused again, bouncing on his toes, and then stuck out his hand towards Daisy. Daisy took it very daintily, and then all of a sudden threw herself forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. "Steady on," said Lord Hastings. "Daisy, come now, you're far too old for this." But as he said it, he lifted her up off her feet so her feet left the stones of the hall entirely. "I'm glad you didn't kill anyone," said Daisy into his ear. "I'm glad you're good." "So am I," said Lord Hastings. "It's a terrible relief, I can tell you. Do you know, I started to wonder if I had ill-wished Mr. Curtis dead." Daisy burst out laughing. "Silly Daddy," she said, letting go of him and leaping down to the ground again. "As if you could." "And you could?" asked her father. "I," said Daisy, "can do anything. And even though she doesn't like to mention it, so can Hazel." She grinned at me, and after a moment I smiled back at her. Lord Hastings shuffled off towards the billiard room, thumping Toast-Dog on his fat pat behind and sighing. I hoped he would be all right. At least he had Chapman, Hetty and Mrs. Docherty to look after him. "Good old Watson," said Daisy. She took my hand and squeezed it. "I'm glad you've been here this holiday. Don't tell anyone, but it would have been awful without you." "You too," I said, and I decided that being friends with Daisy was worth all the murders in the world. "Detective Society forever," said Daisy. "Detective Society forever," I agreed, and we shook hands there in the hall. I felt happy again at last. Chapter 12. On Sunday morning, the last day of holiday before the summer term, I woke up in my narrow, lumpy bed at Deepdene. The window was open, and chilly April morning air was gusting in and creeping under our blankets and sheets. Beanie whimpered and wriggled lower in her bed. Kitty snored, and Lavinia sighed and rolled over like a heavy whale. I could smell the breakfast porridge burning downstairs, and when I turned my head, I saw my trunk gaping open, still only half unpacked. I knew I would catch it from Matron when she came in and saw it. I sat up, my school pyjamas scratching my neck and arms, and took a deep breath. Daisy bounced up out of bed, throwing off her blankets in one wild movement, and waved at me. "Hello, Hazel," she said. "Back to the boredom, cabbage and Latin for miles, and no murder anywhere. Why are you smiling?" "No reason," I said. And just like that, I wasn't homesick anymore. The end. I hope you've enjoyed this book. I've really enjoyed reading it to you. If you've enjoyed the Murder Most Unladylike book, then there are another 6 in the series after this one. Have a read and hope you enjoy them.